just gonna leave me here alone. Oh, we got some people joining. Bella, look. Got people looking at us. Say hi.
Girls.
Oh, CC Bella.
Okay. You want chocolate? No chocolate? If you want chocolate, you just get this bowl. You want this one, bigger one? We're gonna go.
I love you too.
This is the morning. This is why I love that I thrive.
I just want them back. I just want them to come back. And if they're not safe right now, that's what's tearing me apart. Because if they are safe, they're coming back. But if they're not, this has got to stop. Like, somebody has to come forward.
If this stillness holds you, a quiet gesture helps sustain these long-form investigations. Taking a moment to like the video or subscribe allows stories like this to be examined with the time and care they demand, bringing hidden truths into focus, one layer at a time.
Tell them you love them.
You're welcome. We love you.
Say love you.
Candy.
Oh yeah, shoot, that's in here.
Position of trust with respect to the victim in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-3-102, subsection 1, subsection F. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Count 5 alleges murder in the first degree, a Class 1 felony. It alleges that between and including August 12th, 2018 and August 13th, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts unlawfully, feloniously, and knowingly caused the death of Celeste Watts, a child who had not yet attained 12 years of age, and the defendant was in a position of trust with respect to the victim in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-3-102, subsection 1, subsection F. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
With regard to these first 5 counts, the minimum sentence that the court could impose if convicted is life imprisonment in the Colorado Department of Corrections, and the maximum sentence is death. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Let me also point out that pursuant to Rule 32.1 of the Rules of Criminal Procedure,
I don't want them to really go in the ocean. I mean,
Ready, set? Ready, set?
The pool opens in 2 weeks too.
what's the degrees today?
85 last I checked. 120.
Wow.
No, CC.
Yeah.
CC, get girl.
Oh God. Oh my gosh, are you kidding? She can climb that fence.
I don't want to be in it. Get lower.
good morning, you're welcome to be seated. Okay, we are on the record. We are in Division 17 of the Weld County District Court, and we are here regarding Weld County case number 18-CR-2003, people of the state of Colorado versus Christopher Lee Watts. My name is Marcelo Cupcom, a district court judge here in Weld County, and I will be the presiding judge in this case. If I could please have the lawyers identify themselves in the record, starting with the prosecution.
Good morning, Your Honor. Michael Rourke on behalf of the people.
Patrick Roach on behalf of the people. Your Honor, John Walsh on behalf of the defense. Jim Burson on behalf of Mr. Watts. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Rourke, do you want to make a record regarding compliance with the Victims' Rights Act?
Yes, Your Honor. We are in compliance with the Victims' Rights Act. Frank Rusick, who is Shanann Watts' father, is present in the courtroom, as is Frankie Rusick, who is Shanann Watts' brother. They are present in the courtroom, and we have advised them of the purpose of today's hearing and what we expect to occur.
Thank you. Mr. Watts, last week I gave you a limited advisement because charges had not been filed. They have now been filed, so I'm going to give you a full advisement. If at any time you have any questions, please let me know. And you're welcome also
Before the sun rose, the neighborhood still looked like a brochure: clean sidewalks, clipped lawns, garages sealed shut as if nothing inside could ever leak into the street. The air held that late summer stillness that feels almost deliberate, as though the world is holding its breath. A single driveway light burned pale against the dark, and the shadow it cast was long enough to touch the curb. In places like this, the danger does not announce itself. It does not crash through windows or roar down the road. It waits in routine. It hides inside the ordinary, inside the schedules written on phones and the quiet habits of people who wave politely and keep their voices low after dusk. It hides in the assumption that a family home, lit warmly from within, is a sealed environment where love cannot fail catastrophically. And yet there are mornings that begin with a small absence, with a space where a sound should be, and in that hollow space the entire future changes shape. A man stood near the front of his house as daylight began to collect at the edges of the sky. He looked like someone who belonged there, the kind of man who did not draw attention in a crowd, who could move through a grocery store aisle without leaving an impression. His face carried the practiced neutrality of a life built around being agreeable. His posture did not suggest panic. It suggested waiting for something to resolve itself, as though the problem might simply tire and disappear.
To certainly consult with your attorneys, okay? So, you do not need to make any statements. Any statements you make can be used against you. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
You have the right to be represented by counsel, and if you're indigent, you have the right to request the appointment of counsel or consult with the public defender before any further proceedings are held, and I see that you've taken advantage of that right. Any plea that you make must be made voluntarily and not the result of undue influence or coercion. You understand?
Yes, sir.
At this point, I have denied your right to bail, given the charges. You can certainly have a conversation shortly about that issue. You have the right to understand the nature of the charges. We'll go over them in a moment. You have the right to a jury trial. You also have the right to demand and receive a preliminary hearing within a reasonable time to determine whether probable cause exists to believe that the offenses charged were committed by you. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
I assume that the defense has received a copy of the complaint and information. Mr. Watts, let me explain to you what you have been formally charged with and what the possible penalties are. Count 1 alleges that on or about August 13th, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts unlawfully, feloniously, after deliberation, and with the intent to cause the death of a person other than himself, caused the death of Shanna Watts in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-3-102, subsection 1, subsection 8, and that crime is classified as murder in the first degree, a class 1 felony. Do you understand? Count 2 alleges murder in the first degree, also a class 1 felony, and it reads that between and including August 12, 2018 and August 13, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts unlawfully, feloniously, after deliberation, and with the intent to cause the death of a person other than himself, caused the death of Bella Watts in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-3-102, subsection 1, subsection 8. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Count 3 alleges murder in the first degree, a class 1 felony, and specifically it alleges that between and including August 12, 2018 and August 13, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts unlawfully, feloniously, after deliberation, and with the intent to cause the death of a person other than himself, caused the death of Celeste Watts in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-3-102, subsection 1, subsection 8. Do you understand? Count 4 alleges murder in the first degree, a class 1 felony. It alleges that between and including August 12, 2018 and August 13, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts unlawfully, feloniously, and knowingly caused the death of Bella Watts, a child who had not yet attained 12 years of age, and the defendant was in a position of trust with respect to the victim in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-3-102, subsection 1, subsection F. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Count 5 alleges murder in the first degree, a class 1 felony. It alleges that between and including August 12, 2018 and August 13, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts unlawfully, feloniously, and knowingly caused the death of Celeste Watts, a child who had not yet attained 12 years of age, and the defendant was in a position of trust with respect to the victim in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-3-102, subsection 1, subsection F. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
With regard to these first 5 counts, the minimum sentence that the court could impose if convicted is life imprisonment in the Colorado Department of Corrections, and the maximum sentence is death. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Let me also point out that pursuant to Rule 32.1 of the Rules of Criminal Procedure, the prosecutor would have to file a written statement of intent to seek the death penalty no later than 63 days after arraignment. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
If a life imprisonment sentence was imposed, it would be without the possibility of parole. Do you understand that?
Yes, sir.
Count 6 alleges a Class 2 felony of unlawful termination of pregnancy in the first degree. Specifically, it alleges that on or about August 13, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts, with the intent to terminate unlawfully the pregnancy of a woman, namely Shanann Watts, feloniously and unlawfully terminated the pregnancy of the woman. Further, the woman died as a result of the unlawful termination of the pregnancy in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-3.5-103. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
The possible penalties, if convicted for this crime, is a mandatory minimum 16 years in prison up to 48 years in prison, followed by an additional mandatory parole period of 5 years. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Count 7 alleges tampering with a deceased human body, a Class 3 felony. It alleges that on or about August 13, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts, believing that an official proceeding was pending, in progress, or about to be instituted, and acting without legal right or authority, unlawfully and feloniously, willfully destroyed, mutilated, concealed, removed, or altered a human body, part of a human body, or human remains with the intent to impair it or their appearance or availability in the official proceedings in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-8-610.5. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Count 8 alleges also tampering with a deceased human body, a Class 3 felony. It alleges that on or about August 13, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts, believing that an official proceeding was pending, in progress, or about to be instituted, and acting without legal right or authority, unlawfully and feloniously, willfully destroyed, mutilated, concealed, removed, or altered a human body, part of a human body, or human remains with the intent to impair its or their appearance or availability in the official proceeding in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-8-610.5. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
And finally, count 9 alleges tampering with a deceased human body, a Class 3 felony. It alleges that on or about August 13, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts, believing that an official proceeding was pending, in progress, or about to be instituted, and acting without legal right or authority, unlawfully and feloniously, willfully destroyed, mutilated, concealed, removed, or altered a human body, part of a human body, or human remains with the intent to impair its or their appearance or availability in the official proceeding in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-8 1-610.5. With regard to counts 7, 8, and 9, those Class 3 felonies carry a presumptive range of 4 to 12 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections. If there were sufficient mitigating circumstances, the minimum could be as low as 2 years. If there were sufficient aggravating circumstances, as many as 24 years. And any prison sentence would be followed by an additional mandatory parole period of 3 years. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Do you have any questions about what I've said so far?
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Merson, has your office filed a written intent to seek a proof evident presumptive rate hearing?
Not yet, Judge, but we will be following that. This case will be Mr. Walsh's and Ms. Harrell's. They will be attorneys listed on the, I believe, the most recent pleading from the defense.
Okay, thank you. And I would point out, Mr. Watts, that the prosecution also indicated in the complaint information that these were acts of domestic violence. Do you understand that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. And so, Mr. Walsh, what is your request today?
Your Honor, considering that we haven't received any discovery of the case, we're not in a good position at this point to advise the court about what kind of time we'll need. My suggestion to the court is that the court allow Mr. Watts to reserve the preliminary hearing in the case, reserve the proof evident hearing, and set the matter for a status conference about 60 days out.
So just to be clear, he is waiving his right to have a preliminary hearing within 35 days, that he's not seeking a proof evident presumption rate hearing prior to the setting of the status conference in about 60 days, but he's reserving his right to have those hearings in the future, but not necessarily within 35 days. Is that right?
Yes, Your Honor. We've spoken about those issues.
And do you understand what we're talking about, Mr. Watts?
Yes.
Do you have any questions about that? Okay. And Mr. Rourke, do you have any objection to that request?
No, Your Honor, that seems like the prudent way to proceed at this point.
Okay. Let me give you a date that, how does, so 60 days is about October 20th or so. I have October 11th. Does that date work for the parties? I can go a little bit further if you like as well.
I think a little bit further would make sense, Your Honor. Thank you.
How about November 19th? While we're waiting for the lawyers to let me make a record that the court's going to find that Mr. Watts is knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily waiving his right to have a preliminary hearing within 35 days. And while he has not asked for a proof evident presumption rate hearing yet, I'm told that he will, but he's not requesting that hearing prior to the status conference that we're setting today. Agreed?
Yes. That date works fine with the defense, Your Honor. Thank you.
Your Honor, I spoke to the Rusiks, and that is fine with the people as well as the Vickers family.
How is late morning on November 19th?
Anytime, Your Honor. Late morning is fine.
Very good.
How about 10:30?
That'll work for the people.
And that will be in Division 16. I apologize for the bouncing around of division, but my courtroom obviously is not big enough, and I will keep you updated on where the divisions are going to be, but the next court date will be in Division 16. Are there any other questions, comments, concerns, anything that we can address today before us recessing?
I think there are a couple of things outstanding, Your Honor, and first I wanted to address one very ministerial point of clarification with respect to the standing decorum order that the court entered yesterday. By its terms, and when the court defines the applicable areas, that includes my office, specifically the boundaries of the district attorney's office. I just wanted to make a request for clarification that the terms of this order do not apply to the conduct that occurs within my office itself.
Agreed.
Thank you. Otherwise, I have provided a copy of this to the employees of my office, and we will be providing it to law enforcement after this hearing is on.
Thank you. I also intend on issuing a case management order later today, so be on the lookout for that.
I don't know if the court has the desire at this point this morning to address a couple of the other outstanding motions that the Public Defender's Office has filed that we had entered or filed responses to. We have not addressed motions 2, 3, 5, and 7. And those are the defense motions 2, 3, 5, and 7. And for the record, our responses were C, D, E, and F.
I don't have those motions in front of me, but I know that I issued a number of written orders yesterday. Did you receive those?
I received written orders, but not as it relates to those 4, so perhaps they just haven't reached my desk yet.
If they haven't yet, I will issue a written ruling. We'll be getting them shortly. But I issued a number of orders yesterday.
Your Honor, does that include, I did get the order on motion 5 and motion 7. Does that include motions 2 and 3 then that the court would?
Remind me what 2 and 3 are again?
Motion 2 is the motion to allow confidential defense experts to be present for any testing. And we did have a bit of additional argument on that if the court wanted to hear it. Motion 3 is a motion for a protective order.
I prefer they put it in writing, and then I'll issue a written order with regard to that. Is that something that's time sensitive?
I think it could be, Your Honor. I can't speak for the district attorney, but it could be.
I can tell the court, understanding what Mr. Walsh is referring to in motion number 2, it is not something that is going to occur in the next day or 2, so it's not time sensitive in that respect.
So you'll be received, if you want to put something in writing, you're welcome to, and I will issue a written order in a timely manner.
Does the court want to give us a deadline for that?
Sure, when would you like to file a response?
I can have it done in a day or 2.
Okay. And so, do you have control, Mr. Warren, as to when the testing is going to occur?
Absolutely. I can certainly make clear to our forensic agents that pending the litigation or the receipt of a court order on this, that we will not do any forensic testing.
That'd be great. So did you want to have time to file a reply to the response?
If necessary, if I could have 3 business days to file a response to whatever Mr. Walsh files in the next couple of days, I would appreciate that.
Okay, so Mr. Walsh, can you have something filed by close of business tomorrow?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so close of business on Monday, Mr. Warren?
Yes, sir.
Then I'll have something to the parties by midweek next week.
Thank you.
Any other issues that we can resolve today?
Not from the people around.
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Okay, we are in recess. Thank you for your time.
Hey guys, good morning, or I know for Colorado people it's good morning, good afternoon for everybody else. I wanted to come here live because today is the big day for the huge, our cocktail party is tonight where Product X is going to be released. We're super excited. We're heading to the pool right now, and then we have a massage today paid for by Lavelle. Today at 3:30. So Chris and I are super excited. So we're gonna get a massage after we lay by the pool for a little bit and maybe go to the beach again. And then we're going to go to the cocktail party. And we will be live there tonight.
I wanted to say thank you for this moment. I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has prayed for our beloved family, who has sent gifts, cards to us from all over the world. I know God will put the evil people where they need to be. I also want to take the time to thank the town of Frederick, Greeley, FBI, the DA's office, the CBI, for exceptional work. We thank Nicole Atkinson, Shannon's neighbor Nathan, and his family. To me, they're our heroes. They really are. God bless. God makes no mistakes on who he puts in your life. Marriage is about love, trust, and friendship and unity. We marry for sickness and health, to death do us part. Our daughter Shannon loved you with all of her heart. Your children loved you to the moon and back. Shannon's family was her world. Shannon put a crown on your head. But unfortunately, the day that you took their life, God removed that crown. We loved you like a son. We trusted you. Your faithful wife trusted you. Your children adored you, and they also trusted you. Your daughter Bella Marie sang a song proudly. And I don't know if you got to see it, but it was, Daddy, you're my hero. I have no idea who gave you the right to take their lives. But I know God and his mighty angels were there at that moment to bring them home to paradise. God gives us free will. So not only did you take the family of four, your family of four, you took your own life. I want the world to know that our daughter and her children were so loved by us. There will always be protected by God and his mighty angels. I didn't want death for you because that's not my right. Your life is between you and God now, and I pray that he has mercy for you. From Shannon's mother, Bella Marie, Celeste Catherine, and Nico Lee's Nana. Thank you, Your Honor.
The house behind him was not a ruin. It was intact. The door was closed. The windows held their reflections. Nothing about the structure signaled what was about to become attached to it in the minds of millions, a permanent association with betrayal, with vanishing, with the unbearable arithmetic of a family reduced. It is difficult later to reconstruct how quickly certainty dissolves. At first, the missing are not victims in the imagination. They are simply not present. Their absence is a practical puzzle, an unanswered phone, a car still in the driveway, a calendar full of obligations that suddenly becomes irrelevant. The mind insists on normal explanations because normal explanations are survivable. But the scene inside the house did not cooperate with normality. It held traces of interrupted life, objects left where they should not have been left, plans that had stopped mid-motion. There was the quiet suggestion that people had been there recently, that the day had been intended to continue as usual, and that something had cut it off without ceremony. The story that followed would become famous for its details, for its timeline, for its evidence that stacked up like a tightening net. But the core of it was simpler and more disturbing, the possibility that a person can share a home with those closest to him, move through the same rooms, hold the same hands, and still carry within him a private decision so final that it erases everything else. In the months before that morning, the household had been living in a particular kind of pressure, financial strain, the ongoing performance of social media perfection, the unspoken fatigue of adult responsibilities. On the surface, there were images of smiling faces, carefully framed happiness, the bright colors of family life presented to the world as proof that everything was stable. Beneath that surface, the relationships were shifting in ways that did not announce themselves in a single argument or a single dramatic rupture. They shifted like weather, slowly, subtly, until one day the air feels different and no one can say exactly when it changed. The man had been losing weight. That fact, which could have meant nothing, became part of the later portrait, a body altering under new discipline, new attention, new desire to control an outward image. control is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like improvement. Sometimes it looks like a new routine, a renewed interest in health, the appearance of a person trying to become better. At the same time, the center of his private life had begun to tilt away from the home. Another presence had entered his days, at first as a possibility, then as a reality that rearranged his priorities. The language of ordinary adulthood does not prepare anyone for how quickly infatuation can become a solvent. It dissolves obligations. It corrodes patience. It offers a counterfeit version of freedom, a world where consequences feel distant and other people's suffering is abstract. And so two versions of him began to exist simultaneously. There was the man who inhabited the family home, who walked through routines, who presented calm to neighbors, who behaved as though the structure of his life was still intact. And there was the man who was already elsewhere in his mind, who had begun to imagine a different future, a future that did not include the life he had built. This is where true crime becomes uncomfortable in a particular way, because it reveals that catastrophe does not always come from chaos. Sometimes it comes from an orderly decision. Sometimes it comes from someone who appears steady. The wife returned from a trip late at night. The house received her the way it always had: doors, locks, familiar darkness, the heavy quiet of sleeping children. There were no obvious signs of impending disaster. There was only the subtle friction of a relationship that had been strained, the sense of distance that had grown between two adults who could no longer pretend they were moving in the same direction. What happened after that would later be reconstructed not through a single dramatic witness account, not through a shouted confession in the moment, but through the accumulation of small, indifferent facts, phone records, movement, timing, behavior that did not align with what a person would naturally do if the people he loved had simply disappeared. The next morning was not marked by a violent spectacle in public. It was marked by a man moving through the world as though he could keep it together through performance alone. He made calls. He stood in his driveway. He allowed the machinery of concern to begin turning around him. And as it turned, it began to generate heat. Concern has a rhythm in close communities. It spreads quickly because it is both empathy and self-protection. If a mother and children can vanish from a safe neighborhood, then safety itself becomes questionable. People look at their own locks, they watch their own streets, they listen more carefully to the silence at night. The early narrative was simple: a wife and children missing, a husband worried, a family interrupted. But even in the first hours, certain things did not fit. The car was there. Essential items were not where they should have been. The logic of voluntary disappearance weakened under scrutiny. When people vanish on purpose, they usually take the tools required to stay vanished. When people vanish without warning, the world they leave behind carries an imprint of suddenness. The man remained present in the center of this. He offered explanations that were meant to stabilize the moment. He behaved as though the right combination of words, the right posture, could keep the situation within the borders of ordinary concern. His calmness, which might have been interpreted as steadiness, began to read differently as time passed. Calm can be a virtue. It can also be a mask. As hours accumulated, the focus shifted from finding the missing to understanding the last known movements inside the house. The home itself became a kind of silent witness. Objects do not speak, but they preserve. They hold patterns where a purse is usually placed, where shoes are usually left, whether bedding has been disturbed in a way that suggests normal sleep or something else. Even the absence of chaos can be meaningful. A scene that looks too intact can suggest that the disruption happened in a controlled manner. Outside the home, the wider environment began to matter. The route to work, the timing of departure, the distance between claimed actions and recorded actions, the gap between what someone says they did and what the world can verify. And in that gap, a pressure began to build, quiet at first, then heavier, as though the truth was approaching not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, inevitable tide. By late morning, the questions were no longer polite. They were structural. They pressed against the edges of the man's narrative. They required specifics. And specifics are where deception tends to weaken, not because people are incapable of lying, but because reality is complex and lies must be maintained with relentless precision. The neighborhood, which had started the day as a calm stage, began to fill with movement, vehicles arriving, doors opening and closing, the shifting presence of people whose work is to locate what has been hidden. The driveway light that had looked innocuous in the dark now seemed like an artifact from a different world, a world that had ended. The man remained there, in and out of the house, appearing cooperative, appearing engaged, appearing as the figure at the center of a family crisis. Yet the shape of his presence began to look less like grief and more like management, an effort to control how the situation was seen. Control, when it becomes desperate, starts to reveal itself in small ways. A glance held too long, a movement too careful, a face that rearranges itself in response to pressure rather than emotion. And still, the most frightening element was not what anyone could see. It was what could not be seen, what had happened in the hours when the house was quiet, when the street was asleep, when no one was watching. Because in cases like this, the beginning of the end is rarely dramatic in the moment. It is private, it is ordinary. It is a door closing softly, a room darkening, a decision carried out without witnesses. The day continued, and with it the tightening focus on the timeline, on the man's departure from the house, on the hours that followed, on the places he went where the normal rhythms of work and routine could be used as camouflage. The question was no longer whether something was wrong. The question was how far wrong it was and how quickly the truth could be forced into the open. By afternoon, the atmosphere had changed completely. The neighborhood no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a perimeter. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a container for a mystery that was beginning to sour into something darker, something that would not end with a simple explanation. And inside that growing darkness, the man's life began to narrow, his options shrinking as the world's attention sharpened, as the evidence began to form a coherent shape, and as the silence that had once protected him started to work against him. The first cracks in the story did not arrive as a single dramatic break. They arrived as inconsistencies, as details that did not align, as the slow realization that the most obvious explanation was the one people do not want to accept. The house stood in the fading light, unchanged in its structure, but altered forever in meaning, as the search moved from the hope of finding a family safe somewhere else toward the grim necessity of finding out what had happened within the walls of an ordinary life. And as night approached again, the questions that had begun in the stillness of a suburban morning settled into something heavier, something relentless, something that would not allow the man's calm to remain convincing much longer. The night did not restore order. It only amplified the unnatural stillness, because darkness has a way of turning every unanswered question into a presence of its own. Lights stayed on in houses that usually went dark early. Curtains shifted. Cars passed more slowly than they needed to, as though speed itself had become inappropriate. Inside the home, the atmosphere was no longer domestic. It carried the sterile weight of inspection, the sense that ordinary objects had become evidence simply by remaining where they were. A phone left behind was no longer a convenience or an oversight, it became a statement. A purse still in place was no longer an accessory, it became a contradiction. In the language of absence, what remains is often louder than what is gone. The man continued to orbit the center of it all, keeping himself visible, keeping himself accessible, maintaining the impression that he belonged on the inside of concern rather than on the outside of suspicion. But there is a particular strain that begins to appear when a person is forced to inhabit a story that is no longer under his control. The face starts to adjust too quickly. The body begins to anticipate scrutiny. The mind, working too hard, reveals itself through the smallest inefficiencies, gestures that do not align with emotion, pauses that feel calculated rather than natural. The house offered no clear sign of a voluntary departure. The circumstances did not resemble a planned exit. The pattern suggested interruption. It suggested that the future had been cut off while it was still forming. And then the focus tightened onto the earliest hours of the morning, onto the small corridor of time between night and day where routine becomes vulnerable. In that narrow space, the movements of one person began to matter with unusual intensity. A vehicle, in particular, became central, not because it was dramatic, but because it was practical. It could contain answers without making noise. It could carry the difference between a story and the reality beneath it. The man's departure from the house was ordinary in the way that so many departures are ordinary: a door, a vehicle, a familiar route. Yet as attention fixed on that departure, it began to look less like the start of a normal workday and more like the hinge point on which everything turned. The neighborhood itself held a kind of silent memory. A street can feel calm and forgetful, but it retains patterns. People notice when a garage door opens at an unusual time. They notice when a vehicle is positioned strangely. They notice when someone lingers in a driveway with a purpose that does not match the hour. In a safe place, those details often register only as mild curiosities, then vanish. On this morning, they became fragments of a larger reconstruction, each one capable of shifting the entire narrative. As the hours passed, the story the man was trying to present began to narrow. There were only so many explanations that could account for the absence of a pregnant woman and 2 young children, while leaving behind the most essential objects of daily life. Each additional fact acted like a weight, pressing down on the plausibility of any innocent version of events. In the background of this unfolding crisis was another timeline, quieter and more corrosive. It did not begin the night the family vanished. It began earlier in messages, in private meetings, in the slow reorientation of desire. It began in the way a person starts to treat a familiar life as an inconvenience rather than an obligation. Infidelity in itself is not rare. It is not even, in the bluntest sense, surprising. What makes it dangerous in certain hands is the way it can become a justification engine, an internal machine that reframes betrayal as liberation, that recasts responsibility as oppression, that turns other people's needs into obstacles. In that mental architecture, a spouse becomes a barrier. Children become an anchor. The family, once a source of identity, becomes an old life that must be escaped. The man had begun to behave like someone quietly rehearsing another future. His attention drifted away from home and toward a relationship that felt uncomplicated because it had not yet been tested by decades, by finances, by sleepless nights, by the ordinary erosion that comes from sharing a life. A new connection can feel like air after a long time underwater. It can also become a kind of intoxication that strips away empathy by narrowing the world to a single desire. Meanwhile, the wife had been carrying a different kind of burden, one built from anxiety, from the efforts of maintaining stability, from the visible strain of trying to keep a family intact while sensing that something was slipping. The outward image remained bright because outward images are often the last thing people surrender. Even when the inside of a relationship begins to fail, the outside can still look like celebration. The pregnancy mattered. It changed the geometry of the future. It made the household heavier, not only in responsibility but in inevitability. A third child is not merely an addition, it is a further commitment to the life already built. It is a tightening of the bond for those who want it, and a tightening of the trap for someone who is already looking for a door. Over time, the man's demeanor began to split into versions. In public spaces, in the places where he could be observed, he could present concern. He could perform stability. But in the private architecture of his behavior, other signs appeared, an impatience with the ordinary, an urgency to preserve a separate life, an increasing reliance on secrecy. Secrecy leaves traces. It changes how a person uses a phone, how quickly messages are answered, how often the screen is checked. It changes where the mind goes when the body is still. It creates divided attention, and divided attention makes people careless. As scrutiny intensified, the man's careful neutrality began to falter under the weight of the timeline. The question was no longer simply where the missing were. The question was whether his life contained an explanation he had been trying to keep sealed. The days that followed would become defined by a slow conversion, concern turning into suspicion, and suspicion turning into a focused reconstruction of movements, devices, and locations. Every call, every message, every gap in the record became a strand. And as strands accumulated, they began to point away from the neighborhood itself and toward a place tied to his working life, an environment not designed for families, not designed for comfort, but capable of hiding what a home cannot hide. There is a particular bleakness in the idea that routine can provide camouflage. A normal work schedule can become an alibi scaffold. Familiar routes can become concealment. The day can be used like a curtain. People assume that what happens inside it is predictable because it usually is. But this time, the predictability was the trap. The same steadiness that made him unremarkable also made it easier for him to move without drawing immediate alarm. The difference was that now the world was looking, and looking changes everything. It collapses the private into the observable. It turns habits into data. As the pressure built, the atmosphere around the man grew denser, as though the air itself was thickening with what could not yet be proven but was becoming more difficult to avoid. The absence of his family became a weight attached to him, and the weight did not diminish with his calm. It only grew, because calm without resolution begins to look less like strength and more like detachment. The home remained intact, but the meaning of every room shifted. Bedrooms became questions. A staircase became a silent witness to who went up and down and when. A kitchen became a place where the ordinary stopped and the unknown began. And outside, the neighborhood, once built to reassure, began to feel like a stage where the comforting image of a family life had been replaced by a single stark fact: someone had vanished, and the person who should have been most broken by it was still standing. The night settled again, and with it came a new gravity, the sense that the story had already moved beyond a missing person's concern and into something darker, something that would not be solved by hope alone, something that would require the world to follow the man's mourning all the way to its end. The search for a family rarely begins with certainty. It begins with fragments, angles of time, gaps in routine, devices that record without understanding what they have captured. In this case, the ordinary technologies of a quiet subdivision became the first instruments of clarity. A neighbor's camera, positioned for safety and convenience, preserved a small slice of that morning in a way memory could not. The image was not dramatic. It did not show a crime as people imagine a crime should appear. It showed motion in a driveway, the careful geometry of a vehicle, the opening and closing of space. It was the kind of footage that becomes unsettling only when viewed with the knowledge that something is missing. The man's movements carried the stiffness of intention. He did not move like someone searching for an object misplaced in the rush of a workday. He moved like someone executing a sequence he had already rehearsed. The vehicle's placement, the pauses, the repetition of small actions near the rear of the truck, these became points of fixation, not because they proved everything, but because they suggested purpose where purpose did not belong. Purpose is what investigators look for when a person claims confusion. As the day turned into another day, the story ceased to belong to the neighborhood. It began to belong to a broader system that measures time precisely and treats inconsistency as a kind of language. Phone records showed contact that did not align with the portrait of a husband consumed by fear. Location data suggested routes and stops that had no natural connection to a frantic search. The man's outward composure persisted, but the infrastructure of his life, his devices, his movements, his schedule, began to form a narrative that ran parallel to his own. In the private background of this unraveling, the relationship he had been cultivating outside his marriage became impossible to separate from the disappearance. Not because a new relationship automatically implies violence, but because it supplies a motive structure, the desire for a life that feels unencumbered by the obligations of the old one. Motive, in cases like this, often reveals itself not as rage but as a kind of cold arithmetic, an internal calculation about what must be removed for a new future to appear possible. And that is where the case began to darken in a way that did not require graphic detail to be horrifying. The missing were not simply absent from the street. Their absence began to reshape the meaning of the man's choices in the days and weeks leading up to it. Financial pressures and domestic tension were no longer background noise. They became stressors in a closed environment, conditions under which a person might begin to imagine escape as a form of salvation. The pregnancy was no longer merely a family milestone. It became an intensifier, a symbol of permanence at the precise moment the man was privately attempting to loosen every knot tying him to his home. As scrutiny increased, his public performance had to become more specific. The problem with specificity is that it is vulnerable to verification. The more a person explains, the more the world can test those explanations against hard records. A loose story can float. A detailed story can be pinned to the wall. One of the most telling elements in these cases is not what a person says, but what he does when faced with a structured challenge to his version of events. Pressure changes posture. It changes breathing. It changes the rhythm of responses. It reveals whether a person is drawing from memory or assembling a narrative in real time. Under controlled observation, the man's calm began to fracture at the edges, not into hysteria, but into something more revealing, urgency. Urgency can be misunderstood as concern, but in a room where the goal is truth, urgency sometimes looks like a person realizing that the world is closing in faster than expected. The focus tightened again, away from the home and toward the place the man had gone after he left it. His work site was not a setting people associate with family life. It was industrial, remote enough to feel separate from the moral atmosphere of a neighborhood. It was defined by equipment and process, by the impersonal logic of function. It was also a place where a person could stand alone without attracting attention, a place where silence is normal and where the landscape does not ask questions. Remote places have a particular significance in crimes of concealment. They are chosen not only for distance but for indifference. The land does not witness in the human way. It does not remember faces. It does not object to what is placed upon it. In the days that followed, the case advanced through the slow accumulation of physical realities. The missing could not remain abstract forever. The world demanded answers that could be measured, located, confirmed. When the search moved to the work site, it carried with it a shift in tone, away from rescue and toward recovery, away from hope and toward the heavy work of finding what someone had tried to remove from sight. The man's presence within this progression became increasingly untenable. A person can withstand suspicion when it remains vague. He cannot withstand it when it becomes geographic, when it narrows to a location he alone had reason to access at a particular time, when the timeline points not to a general danger in the world, but to a specific corridor of hours he occupied. This is the moment when the story of a missing family often turns from uncertainty to inevitability. The world does not need a confession to recognize a pattern. It needs coherence, and coherence can be built from evidence that has no emotion in it at all. When the truth finally broke through, it did not arrive as a clean, singular revelation. It arrived as a collapse of narrative, of posture, of the possibility that the disappearance could still be explained by anything ordinary. The man's private life, once split neatly into compartments, spilled into the open. The relationship outside his marriage was no longer a rumor. It was a fact with weight, a fact that altered every earlier detail. It rewrote his recent past. It transformed his behavior from merely unusual to structurally suspicious. And then the central horror solidified. The missing were not missing in the sense people want to believe. They were missing in the sense that someone had decided they should not be found. Even then, the atmosphere remained strangely restrained. There was no cinematic explosion of violence on screen, no public spectacle of chaos that matched the magnitude of what had happened. Instead, there was the slow, grim movement of process. Forms, sealed areas, measured steps, a methodical advance through the physical world to locate what had been concealed. The work of revealing a hidden crime is rarely dramatic. It is meticulous, it is quiet, it feels almost inadequate compared to the human devastation underneath it. The reality, once established, did not create closure. It created a new kind of silence, heavier than the silence of uncertainty, because the question shifted again. The question was no longer where the family was. The question was how a life that looked so ordinary could contain a decision so annihilating. In the weeks that followed, the public learned the details in the way the public always does, piecemeal, through disclosures, through timelines, through the slow release of information that transforms private horror into shared knowledge. The man's face, once anonymous, became widely recognized. The house, once a symbol of stability, became a landmark of betrayal. The names of the wife and children became inseparable from a kind of collective grief that does not depend on personal acquaintance to feel real. And still, the most disturbing element remained psychological rather than physical. The evidence suggested not a sudden break from reality, but a steady drift into a mindset where other human beings could be reduced to obstacles. Not enemies, not strangers, family. As legal proceedings approached, the atmosphere shifted again. The case moved from the raw urgency of discovery into the heavy architecture of consequence. Rooms became quieter. Time became slower. The world began to watch not for suspense, but for acknowledgement, an accounting of what had been done, and a reckoning that could never restore what had been taken. The man, once standing in a driveway under a pale light, now existed within a different kind of enclosure, one built not of suburban walls but of procedure and finality, as the process gathered itself to formalize what the evidence had already made impossible to ignore. And behind every procedural step, behind every document and measured movement, the same bleak question remained, hanging in the air with no comfort inside it: how a person can live alongside love for years and still decide in silence to erase it. The question hung there because it could not be answered by procedure alone. Procedure can establish what happened and when. It can attach responsibility to a name. It cannot fully explain the internal turning point where a person stops seeing his family as human beings with weight and permanence and starts seeing them as a problem to be solved. As the case moved forward, the public record began to fill with versions of events that shifted under pressure. The early posture of uncertainty could not survive contact with the timeline. The story that the man presented careful, outwardly coherent, was forced into narrower and narrower corridors until there was no room left for it to stand. At that point, the center of gravity moved. The disappearance no longer needed a theory. It had a shape, and the shape pointed back to him. In a situation like this, the mind often reaches for an explanation that makes the outcome feel less frightening. People look for a single flash of rage, a single triggering argument, a moment where the man's face changed and revealed an obvious monster underneath. But the case did not offer that comfort. What it suggested instead was a colder, more controlled erasure, an act that required not only violence but organization, and not only organization but the ability to move afterward as if the world had not ended. That capacity, the ability to maintain a normal surface while concealing a private catastrophe, is what made the story feel contagious. It infected the public imagination because it seemed to threaten the assumptions that keep daily life stable. If someone could do this while still appearing mild, still appearing presentable, then the usual signals people rely on were no longer reliable. The legal path began to take on its own heavy rhythm. There were documents, appearances, the slow formalization of facts into a case that could withstand scrutiny and consequence. The atmosphere around these proceedings was not theatrical, even when the world watched. It was severe. It was built from small, deliberate steps that felt almost too quiet for the scale of what had been done. The man's demeanor became part of the observation, not as a spectacle, but as a kind of ongoing question. In moments when most people would fracture, he often held a stillness that did not read as grief. It read as containment. Containment can be an attempt to survive shame. It can also be an attempt to preserve a self-image even when the exterior world has already collapsed. As more information entered the public view, the outline of motive hardened into something recognizable, though never fully satisfying. There was the pull of the other relationship, the fantasy of a new life unburdened by the practical weight of family. There was the pressure of finances and appearances. There was the exhaustion of maintaining two selves at once. None of these elements were rare in the world. What was rare was the decision to resolve them by annihilation. When the case reached its most consequential stage, the room itself mattered. The air in such a place feels different, not because the building is different, but because everyone inside it is carrying the same knowledge at the same time. A person's posture, the way he holds his hands, the way his eyes move or refuse to move, becomes part of the landscape. The absence of the victims is also present there, not as a ghostly sentiment, but as a weight that presses on every procedure. Even silence becomes a form of testimony because it forces the mind to fill in what is no longer visible. The outcome moved toward finality in a way that was both swift and irreversible. There would be no extended unraveling over months of televised uncertainty, no long season of suspenseful surprises. Instead, the process compressed, and the case shifted into its concluding posture with the bleak efficiency of a system designed to close doors once the facts are fixed. What remained afterward was not relief. It was aftermath. A home can be emptied of people and still hold their imprint. Rooms keep the memory of small bodies running across floors, of routines repeated until they become invisible. After the case, the house became something else, a structure that carried a narrative too heavy for its walls. It stood as a reminder that a family can be destroyed without the neighborhood ever hearing the exact moment it happened. That kind of destruction does not always announce itself to the outside world. Sometimes it simply arrives, and then it is too late. The public continued to look for meaning in the smallest artifacts. The man's expressions in old photographs, his posture in family videos, the cadence of ordinary days preserved on social media. People scrutinized what had once seemed harmless, trying to find the warning that would make the ending feel inevitable instead of arbitrary. But inevitability is a false comfort. If the ending were inevitable, then it could be avoided by identifying the signs. The case resisted that reassurance. It showed how a person can appear engaged while being emotionally absent, how he can perform the role of husband and father while privately dismantling the empathy required to sustain that role. In the years that followed, the man's existence continued, but it moved into a kind of permanent narrowing. His world became smaller, measured in routine and restriction, separated from the life he had once inhabited so easily. The consequences did not correct the past. They only fixed his future into a shape that could not expand again. And still, the most unsettling element of the story remained untouched by any sentence, the quiet interior shift that allows a person to treat love as disposable. It is one thing to fail someone, to betray them, to abandon them. It is another to erase them, then stand in a driveway under morning light and attempt to speak the language of worry as though it were still believable. That image endured because it captured the central contradiction of the case, a man attempting to remain ordinary at the exact moment his ordinariness had become the most frightening part of what he was. The neighborhood eventually returned to its routines. Lawns were trimmed again. New cars arrived. The seasons moved through their predictable changes. But predictability, once broken, never fully repairs itself. For those who lived close enough to feel the shock in real time, quiet mornings would always carry a faint distortion, a sense that calm can be manufactured, and that the worst outcomes do not always announce their approach. The case settled into public memory the way certain stories do, less as a sequence of facts and more as a warning without a clear lesson. It remained an example not of chaos but of concealment, not of a stranger's sudden intrusion but of a familiar presence turning lethal in silence. And long after the legal process had finished its work, the unanswered question remained, not as a mystery of who, but as a more enduring disturbance of how. In the end, what the world was left with was not closure, but a stark, quiet understanding that some tragedies are not storms that arrive from outside. but collapses that begin inside a home in the private space between two people where a decision can be made without witnesses, and where the ordinary can, without warning, become unforgivable. Afterward, the machinery of the world did what it always does when a story becomes larger than the people who lived it. It archived. It categorized. It stored the events in files and databases and recordings, turning a private catastrophe into something searchable, sortable, and endlessly retrievable. A family that had once existed primarily in the small radius of their own routines became a permanent fixture in the public imagination, reappearing whenever a new viewer discovered the case, whenever a new headline drew attention back to it, whenever the culture returned to the same uneasy fascination with domestic disaster. The strange consequence of modern notoriety is that time does not behave normally. For the community that lived through the disappearance, the days moved forward with exhausting slowness, each hour heavy with uncertainty and then with confirmation. For the wider public, the story could be entered at any point, consumed in compressed form and then replayed again and again. The case became an object people could revisit without the cost of living it, and that distance altered the way the narrative was held. It became, for many, a sequence of clues and reveals, a construction of suspense, a puzzle that could be discussed and dissected. But beneath that structure remained a simpler truth: the victims did not have the luxury of distance, and the people who loved them did not have the luxury of repetition without consequence. In the wake of a case like this, the most persistent pressure is not only grief. It is exposure. A family's most ordinary images, birthdays, holidays, small moments meant to be kept inside the boundaries of private life, become artifacts in the hands of strangers. The very materials that once served as proof of happiness become evidence of what was lost. Every photograph becomes double-sided: on one side, the innocence of the moment; on the other, the knowledge of how it ended. The home itself, once the center of that image, becomes uninhabitable in a way that has nothing to do with walls. People often speak of places being haunted, but the reality is more practical and more severe. Certain spaces become saturated with meaning until they can no longer hold anything else. A room cannot simply be a room again when the public has learned to associate it with finality. Even if the structure remains, the narrative adheres to it like a stain that cannot be scrubbed away. The man's life, reduced to confinement and routine, did not vanish from public interest as quickly as the legal outcome might have suggested. Cases like this do not end cleanly in the public mind because the crime does not feel like an interruption from outside. It feels like a betrayal of the basic assumption that family life, for all its strain, is anchored by a core reluctance to do irreversible harm. When that assumption is shattered, people search for a mechanism that would restore it. They search for the moment he became different, for the point where he could have turned away, for some insight that would make the outcome seem less like a terrifying possibility lurking in plain sight. That search often produces a kind of secondary narrative, one made from the fragments of a person's past. Old videos are watched with new eyes. Expressions are examined for signs of detachment. Gestures are interpreted as clues. Ordinary discomfort becomes ominous in retrospect. It is an understandable impulse, but it also reveals something about how the human mind tries to defend itself. If the warning signs can be located, then the world can be made safer again through vigilance. The problem is that hindsight is a ruthless editor. It can make any minor detail look like a foreshadowing. It can rearrange the past into a story that feels coherent, even if it was never coherent in real time. What remains more reliable is not the search for hidden signs in old footage, but the structure of the man's choices as they became visible through evidence, the compartmentalization, the gradual shift of empathy into self-interest, the reshaping of reality to accommodate a private desire for escape. Those elements do not require dramatization to feel chilling. They are chilling precisely because they are mundane. They can exist in ordinary lives without tipping into violence, and yet, in this case, they did. The relationship outside the marriage continued to cast a long shadow over public interpretation, not because it offered a complete explanation, but because it clarified the emotional geometry of the period leading up to the crime. It demonstrated how quickly a person can begin to treat his current life as temporary once he believes he has another one waiting. It also showed how fantasy can rewrite obligation. In the mind of someone desperate for reinvention, the future can become so vivid that the present feels like an obstacle that must be cleared, not a reality that must be honored. The financial strain added another layer of pressure that made the household feel less like a sanctuary and more like a system under stress. Debt, payments, appearances maintained for the outside world, these are not uncommon burdens. They become dangerous only when they intersect with a personality that views pressure not as a shared problem, but as a personal trap. In that mindset, partnership becomes resentment. Responsibility becomes insult. The people who depend on him become evidence that he is not free. This is how a domestic life can become distorted in the mind of someone who has stopped seeing it as a mutual project. The same features that once gave the man identity, husband, father, provider, begin to feel like labels imposed from outside, roles he did not choose, even if he did choose them. And when a person begins to experience his own life as an imposition, his relationship to others can turn transactional. People become obstacles or assets or liabilities. The human complexity of them begins to fade. In the aftermath, the public often wants a clear category. It wants to decide what kind of man this was. It wants a simple diagnosis, a single phrase that can explain the annihilation of an entire family. But the record, as it sits in reality, resists simplicity. It suggests a person capable of long performance, capable of appearing ordinary while privately disengaging from empathy. It suggests a person who did not erupt in public chaos, but who maintained enough control to continue moving through the day as though he could outpace consequence. That ability, control without visible emotion, became one of the most enduring aspects of the case's impact. It changed the way people looked at calmness. It altered the meaning of a composed face in a crisis. It injected doubt into the familiar reassurance that panic looks like guilt and steadiness looks like innocence. The case showed with quiet brutality that composure can be a tool, and that the absence of visible distress is not the same as the presence of truth. Beyond the public's fixation, there was the quieter, more permanent realm of loss, the families left behind, who had to live in a world where the names of their loved ones were no longer private, where grief was not only internal but exposed to commentary, analysis, and constant return. Grief under those conditions becomes complicated. It must coexist with repetition. It must endure strangers revisiting the story as entertainment or fascination. It must carry itself through anniversaries and headlines and renewed attention that arrives without warning. The man's confinement, too, carried its own strange form of permanence. A person can be removed from society and still remain present in the cultural mind, held there by the sheer incomprehensibility of his choices. His world narrowed to routine, but the story of what he did remained expansive, reproducing itself endlessly across screens and conversations. In that sense, the case did not end. It continued as a kind of ongoing disturbance, quiet, persistent, returning whenever people needed to test their assumptions about what a family is supposed to be safe from. And in the background of that continuing disturbance, the most haunting feature of the story remained what it had always been, the ordinariness of the beginning, the quiet street, the normal house. The familiar routines that in other families continue day after day without catastrophe. That ordinariness did not soften with time, it sharpened. It became the blade edge of the case's meaning because it implied that the boundary between normal life and irreversible destruction is sometimes thinner than anyone wants to admit. The world moved forward, as it always does, carrying new stories, new cases, new outrages. But this one stayed lodged in memory because it did not offer the comfort of distance. It did not belong to a shadowy stranger or an unfamiliar setting. It belonged to a home that could have been any home, to a man who could have been any man in a crowd, to a life that looked familiar enough to feel safe, until, abruptly, it was not. And even as the years continued to layer themselves over the event, the case retained its ability to make quiet places feel slightly less reliable, as though every calm morning carries, somewhere beneath it, the faint possibility of a decision made in silence, unseen until it is already done. There are places where that faint possibility never fully leaves. It becomes part of the local air, like a seasonal change that does not show itself in temperature, but in attention. People still drive past the house and lower their voices without meaning to. They still feel a small tightening in the chest when they see the familiar shape of the roofline, because the mind attaches itself to landmarks when it cannot attach itself to resolution. In time, the physical site becomes less important than the pattern it represents. The house is only a container. The pattern is what persists, the slow separation of a man's internal life from the life he displays, the quiet rearrangement of priorities, the gradual disappearance of empathy under the pressure of desire and self-preservation. The record of the case remains, and it is dense. It contains timestamps and images and sequences of action that, when assembled, create a narrative more complete than any single human memory could provide. And yet even a complete narrative leaves an empty space. It cannot answer what the man felt in the moments when no one was watching. It cannot measure the precise degree of calculation or the precise moment when the thought became a plan. The record can show intention through behavior, but it cannot fully map the internal climate that made the behavior possible. That gap is where the case continues to live. The man's later existence becomes defined by repetition of a different kind. Days measured not by family routines but by a controlled schedule. The body still moves through time, still eats, still sleeps, still ages. But the world narrows, and in that narrowing the mind is left with a particular kind of silence. Silence that cannot be filled with distraction, silence that does not contain the small relief of domestic noise. This is not a dramatic punishment. It is a slow, enclosing condition that forces a person to remain close to what he has done, whether he wants to or not. Even within that narrowing, the story does not become quiet. It continues to circulate outside him. It grows beyond him. It becomes a cultural object with its own momentum, revisited by those who were not there, discussed by people who never walked those streets, analyzed by minds trying to make the ending feel less arbitrary. The case becomes a reference point whenever another domestic crime rises into view, as though the world keeps returning to the same question because it has not yet learned how to live comfortably with the answer. The wife and children, meanwhile, exist in a different permanence. Their lives cannot continue, but their presence does not vanish. It shifts into memory, into images, into the heavy way people speak their names. Their identities become preserved in public spaces where no family should have to be preserved. Their ordinary moments become the only remaining form of them available to strangers, smiles captured in bright rooms, small hands raised in gestures that once meant nothing beyond play, the simple evidence of life that becomes unbearable when life is no longer possible. For those closest to them, that preservation is complicated. There is comfort in proof that they existed as themselves, not as symbols. But there is also a kind of violation in the endless circulation of their faces, in the way their private family life becomes a subject for public attention. Mourning is meant to be intimate. In this case, it is forced into public view, and the public view is not gentle. It can be curious, it can be hungry, it can be careless. It can return to the story repeatedly without understanding what it costs to have no escape from it. The case also leaves behind an afterimage that changes small daily behaviors in people who were never directly involved. It makes spouses look at each other for a fraction of a second longer when something feels off. It makes friends pay attention to quiet complaints that might otherwise be brushed aside. It makes neighbors reframe certain signs: withdrawal, sudden transformation, a person's abrupt interest in a new life, as potentially more significant than they want them to be. And still, the case resists being turned into a clean set of warnings. There were pressures and stressors, but many households carry pressures without violence. There were lies, but many lives contain lies without annihilation. There was betrayal, but betrayal is common, and this was something else entirely. What the story exposes is not a universal sequence that guarantees an outcome. It exposes a capacity, the capacity for a person to treat other human beings as removable. that capacity is not distributed evenly. It is not predictable in the way people want it to be. It can hide behind politeness. It can hide behind routine. It can hide behind a person who appears cooperative, a person who seems calm, a person who can stand in the open and still keep a private reality sealed. The sealed reality is where everything begins. It begins with internal language that changes gradually. A spouse becomes described in the mind not as a partner but as a force. Children become described not as lives but as obligations. Responsibility becomes described not as meaning but as weight. This is not a dramatic transformation. It is a private shift in framing, a slow alteration of how a person narrates his own life to himself. When that internal narration becomes rigid enough, it can justify almost anything. It can turn empathy into inconvenience. It can turn harm into necessity. The evidence in this case suggested a person moving through those internal changes while maintaining the outer shell of normalcy. That is the element that continues to disturb long after the facts are known. The outer shell did not crack until it had to. It held right up until it could no longer withstand verification. It held through the early hours of scrutiny, through the performance of concern, through the attempt to keep the narrative intact. The collapse of that shell did not restore what was lost. It only revealed the scale of the loss. With time, the case also reshapes the way people think about truth. Not truth as a philosophical idea, but truth as a practical force that pushes against deception until deception breaks. In this story, truth did not arrive because someone suddenly chose honesty. It arrived because reality has weight, and weight leaves marks. A vehicle's movement leaves a trail. A device records location. A schedule creates expectations. A person's behavior, compared against the structure of the day, begins to either align or stand out. The truth, in other words, emerged not as a confession of the soul, but as the result of pressure applied to the world's physical record. That physical record becomes a kind of second witness, one that does not soften its account out of fear or shame. It offers only what it has captured, and when what it has captured contradicts what a person claims, the contradiction becomes its own story, louder than any spoken explanation. The man's life, narrowed to a confined environment, continues to be defined by that contradiction. He exists in a place where routine is enforced, where the future is no longer something he can improvise. The new life he privately imagined, unburdened, clean, open, is gone. What remains is a life built from limits, and in those limits a person is left with a relentless companionship, his own memory, whether he acknowledges it fully or not. Outside, the world continues to absorb the case into the broader archive of domestic crime. It is grouped with other stories of husbands who appeared ordinary, families who appeared happy, communities that appeared safe. It becomes part of an expanding collective awareness that danger does not always arrive with obvious signals. Yet even within that collective awareness, there is an uncomfortable truth. No amount of vigilance can fully erase unpredictability. People can observe, they can learn, they can be cautious, but they cannot see inside another person's private decisions until those decisions emerge into action. This is why the story retains its shadow. It does not offer a solution that can be universally applied. It offers only a kind of knowledge that sits heavily in the mind that the exterior of a life is not proof of its interior. When the case is revisited again and again, it is often because the mind wants to locate a point of no return, a clear moment when the outcome could have been prevented, but the story refuses to present such a moment cleanly. It suggests a series of small retreats from responsibility, a series of internal permissions granted quietly, a gradual movement toward a decision that became irreversible. The point of no return may have existed, but it was not marked with a sign. It was likely experienced as ordinary at the time, just another moment in a relationship strained and complicated, just another private thought that did not announce itself as lethal. The wife's final days, as they appear through the record, carry a particular heaviness because they are threaded with ordinary concerns, plans, routines, expectations, and with the invisible awareness that something is wrong. Not wrong in a way that predicts annihilation, but wrong in the way a person senses emotional absence and feels the ground shifting under familiar feet. That kind of wrongness is common in failing relationships. What makes it unbearable here is the knowledge that the failing was not heading towards separation or negotiation or shared grief, but toward erasure. The children, too, remain central to the enduring horror not through any graphic detail, but through the sheer innocence implied by their existence. Their lives were not complicated. Their world was small, anchored by caregivers, defined by trust. The violation of that trust is what continues to reverberate, because it represents a break not only of a family bond but of the basic assumption that adults will protect the small lives dependent on them. With time, the public's language around the case shifts. Early language is urgent, focused on the missing. Later language is analytical, focused on motive and sequence. Eventually, the language becomes almost ritual, repeating the same facts, the same images, as though repetition itself could produce comprehension. But comprehension, in the deepest sense, never fully arrives. The facts become known, and yet the emotional reality remains too large to fit neatly into understanding. So the story persists in a kind of suspended gravity. It is not actively unfolding anymore, but it is not at rest either. It lives in the gap between knowledge and acceptance, between what can be proven and what can be emotionally absorbed. And somewhere far from that quiet neighborhood, in a confined world measured by strict routine, the man continues to wake into the same narrow day, carrying a history that cannot be undone, while the wider world continues to return to the same bleak, quiet disturbance, turning it over, examining it, trying to locate, within its ordinary beginnings, the precise moment when the calm morning stopped being safe and became something else entirely. Because once a calm morning becomes something else, it never fully returns to what it was before. It may resume its habits, its light through the windows, its cars backing out of driveways at predictable hours. But it carries a faint distortion, as though the air has been permanently altered by an event that proved how fragile the surface really is. In the years after the case hardened into record, the story continued to exert pressure on the culture for a reason that went beyond its facts. It forced people to confront the uncomfortable mismatch between appearance and reality, between the image of a family and the private mechanisms that can destroy one. It made the modern hunger for visibility feel darker, not because visibility is inherently harmful, but because it can be mistaken for truth. The home, broadcast in bright fragments, had looked stable. The faces had looked happy. The captions had looked like reassurance, and yet the life behind them had been deteriorating in ways that did not register until it was too late. There is a cruelty in that form of deterioration because it is quiet. It does not always produce the kind of outward conflict that would force intervention. It can manifest as emotional absence masked by politeness, as a tightening of impatience disguised as fatigue, as a withdrawing mind hidden behind a functioning body. To those inside the home, it can feel like walking through a familiar house where the temperature has subtly dropped. Nothing looks different, but nothing feels the same. The record suggested that the man's internal detachment had grown over time, fed by secrecy and reinforced by the private thrill of a divided life. Secrecy is not merely the hiding of information. It is an alteration of self. It teaches a person to split, to choose which version of himself appears in which room, to become comfortable with contradiction. Over time, contradiction stops feeling like a problem and starts feeling like a skill. A person who becomes skilled at contradiction can begin to treat honesty as optional, as a tool used only when convenient, rather than as a foundation. In that environment, the simplest human exchanges become distorted. A spouse asking for reassurance is no longer heard as a request for connection. It is heard as pressure. A family obligation is no longer heard as shared responsibility. It is heard as constraint. A child's needs are no longer heard as life unfolding. They are heard as interruption. The mind, once it adopts that framing, does not need hatred to do damage. It needs only an absence of empathy strong enough to allow harmful decisions to feel in the moment like solutions. The community's role in the story remained significant, not because communities can solve what happens behind closed doors, but because communities supply the illusion of safety. A neighborhood like that is designed for predictability. It is designed for shared assumptions that families argue and reconcile, that money problems create stress and then pass, that a marriage can strain without collapsing into irreversible harm. When those assumptions fail, the entire environment feels less trustworthy, not only for those who lived there, but for anyone who recognizes the design and has relied on it. The case also revealed how quickly perception becomes a battlefield. In the early days, the man's outward calm could have been interpreted in multiple ways. Some people read calm as strength, others read it as emptiness. The truth of it was less important than the fact that the calm existed at all, because it demonstrated that a person can maintain a controlled exterior even while his private reality is collapsing. That lesson lingers, and it alters how people read each other in crises. It introduces doubt where people want certainty, and it makes ordinary human behavior feel suddenly ambiguous. This ambiguity extends beyond the case itself. It touches every situation where the public is asked to judge a person's sincerity based on posture and expression. It forces the recognition that performance is not always conscious, and that a person can perform without fully realizing he is performing. The man's attempt to inhabit the role of the worried husband may have been strategic, but it also may have been reflexive, the last remaining behavior pattern of a life that had been built on appearing agreeable, appearing stable, appearing normal. Sometimes the mask outlives the person inside it, continuing to move even after the interior has changed. There is another layer to this story that remained quietly central, the presence of children not as symbols but as realities with daily rhythms. Their routines were small and dependable, defined by sleep, play, and the simple trust that adults will make the world safe. When such trust is broken, it does not create a dramatic scene that the world can understand easily. It creates a kind of moral vacuum, a silence that people struggle to fill with language. The mind instinctively rejects the idea because it violates one of the few assumptions that feel fundamental. This is why the case did not settle into the archive as easily as others might. It did not contain the distancing comfort of a stranger's intrusion. It did not present violence as an external threat invading a home. It presented the home itself as the site of collapse and the familiar presence inside it as the source of danger. That shift makes the story harder to contain because it suggests that safety is not only about locks or neighborhoods or awareness of the outside world. It suggests that safety is also about what can happen within a relationship when empathy fails. The years that followed also showed how public memory functions when it attaches itself to a case. The story becomes compressed into a set of repeated images: the house, the family photographs, the man's face. These images become shorthand, and shorthand can be both useful and corrosive. Useful because it allows the public to remember the victims as real. Corrosive because it can reduce complex lives into a single narrative. A family becomes known primarily for its ending. A person becomes known primarily for the moment he was exposed. The interior richness of their days, the mundane texture of ordinary life, becomes secondary to the structure of the crime. And yet that mundane texture is what makes the loss feel real. The tragedy is not only that lives ended. It is that life, in all its smallness and repetition, was interrupted. Meals that would have been made, birthdays that would have been celebrated, arguments that would have been forgotten, mornings that would have unfolded into ordinary afternoons, all of it vanished into a blank space where time should have continued. The legal process, for all its severity, could only address a portion of that blank space. It could formalize responsibility. It could impose consequence. It could not restore the future that had been erased. It could not give the family back their private continuity, the simple privilege of growing older together without becoming a story. In the world outside the formal process, the after-effects continued to echo in quieter ways. People who had lived through the shock carried it into their own relationships as an uneasy awareness, a subtle recalibration of what they considered possible. Some became more attentive. Some became more suspicious. Some became more protective of their private lives, as though privacy itself could serve as insulation against exposure and loss. Others moved in the opposite direction, seeking more proof, more visibility, more documentation, because documentation in a world where truth can be disputed feels like a shield. But documentation is not protection, it is only record. The case demonstrated that record can be powerful in reconstructing what happened after the fact, but it cannot prevent the fact from occurring. Cameras can capture movement, not intention. Messages can show contact, not conscience. A timeline can reveal contradiction, not the precise moment when empathy vanished. For prevention, people want a clear signal, a reliable indicator. Yet the story continued to resist that desire. It suggested that the most dangerous shifts can occur in the quiet interior space where only one person knows the full extent of what he is allowing himself to consider. What endures, then, is not a clear lesson but a heightened awareness of fragility. The fragility of appearances, the fragility of trust, the fragility of a domestic world that, from the outside, looks unbreakable because it has been built to look that way. And still, even in that awareness, the mind returns to the same image, the calm street, the ordinary house, the sense of routine that should have protected the day. Because that is where the disturbance remains most vivid. Not in the confined world where the man's life narrowed afterward, not in the legal formalities that sealed the case, but in the beginning, when everything still looked normal enough to pass without comment. A beginning like that is unsettling precisely because it does not announce itself as the beginning of anything. It is simply a morning, the kind of morning people forget. The kind of morning that, in most homes, leads to lunch and then to evening and then to another day. In this home, it led somewhere else. And as the case continues to live in public memory, it continues to cast that thin shadow over ordinary life, reminding anyone who revisits it that there are moments when the world is still and quiet, when the light is soft, when nothing appears wrong. And yet, just beyond what can be seen, a decision has already been made, and the day is already moving toward a reality no one in the neighborhood can yet name. In the months that followed, the case did not simply fade into the background of another year. It settled into a slower, heavier phase, one where the urgency of the first days was replaced by a different kind of pressure. The long work of living after certainty has arrived. Certainty does not bring peace in a story like this. It brings definition. It fixes the event in place, removes the last thin layer of hope that something misunderstood might still be corrected, and replaces it with a permanent reality that cannot be argued with. Once the truth becomes immovable, the mind is forced to reorganize around it. People do not simply accept it. They adapt to it, and adaptation is not the same as healing. The town itself began to carry a split identity. It remained, in its visible structure, the same place it had been: roads, schools, storefronts, the ordinary geography of suburban life. But it also became a reference point, a name attached to an event that outsiders would mention with a certain tone, as though the location itself had changed substance. For residents, that attention could feel like an invasion, not because the truth should be hidden, but because ordinary communities are not built to become symbols. They are built to be lived in quietly. Quiet living became harder. There were days when the street looked normal again, and then a car would slow down for no reason other than recognition, and the atmosphere would tighten. There were moments when the mind of a neighbor would drift back to that morning without invitation, as though memory had learned to return at random. Trauma, even secondhand, does not behave politely. It interrupts. It revises the meaning of familiar sounds, an engine starting early, a door closing, a voice carried across a yard. Inside homes that had nothing to do with the case, small domestic tensions began to feel slightly different. Arguments that would normally be shrugged off took on an edge of seriousness for those who had watched the story unfold too closely. This was not because people believed they were living the same life. It was because the case had demonstrated something unsettling, that domestic life can contain hidden chambers, that a person can share space and still remain unknowable. The public's continued focus on the man's psychology reflected a deeper discomfort. People wanted the kind of explanation that would place him in a separate category, something that could be identified, labeled, and kept at a safe distance. But the case resisted being contained in that way because so much of his life on the surface had been unexceptional. He had not looked like an outsider. He had not sounded like a threat. His ordinariness was the most destabilizing element because it forced the recognition that danger can be housed inside familiarity. As time passed, the story began to generate a particular kind of analysis that often attaches itself to cases of domestic annihilation. Observers began to talk less about the physical sequence of events and more about the gradual erosion that precedes such acts, the way resentment can build silently, the way a person's internal narrative can shift from partnership to grievance, from shared life to private fantasy. Fantasy is often misunderstood as harmless because it happens in the mind. But when fantasy becomes a refuge from responsibility, it can also become a weapon against reality. The man's new relationship did not merely offer him companionship. It offered him a vision of himself unburdened, an identity stripped of debt, marriage strain, parental responsibility, and the daily friction of being accountable to other people. That vision, once it took hold, would have demanded a payment. The more vivid the fantasy became, the more intolerable the old life may have felt. The case suggested that he tried, at least for a time, to manage that payment through ordinary deception, through compartmentalization, through concealment, through the hope that he could keep two lives running in parallel without collision. That kind of management can work briefly in the shallow sense that lies often work briefly. But parallel lives are unstable by design. They require constant maintenance, and maintenance exhausts the mind. Over time, the energy required to keep both versions intact can create a pressure that feels, to the person doing it, like entrapment. Entrapment is a dangerous perception when it is paired with self-centered reasoning. In a healthier mind, the sensation of being trapped leads to negotiation, separation, therapy, honest rupture. In a mind that has begun to view other people as obstacles rather than as humans, entrapment can lead to the search for a single, irreversible solution that eliminates complexity. This is where the story's most unsettling feature returned again and again, the way the man appeared to move toward finality without the outward markers of collapse. There was no public breakdown that would have signaled an emergency. There was no dramatic departure that would have warned those around him. The external life remained functional right up until the moment it could not remain functional anymore. For the victim's loved ones, the later phase of the story unfolded as a grim endurance test. their grief existed under an additional weight. This is one of the grim truths that sits at the center of the story. Concealment works until it does not. It works precisely because many people are decent enough to assume decency. They interpret oddness as stress, distance as fatigue, changes as the normal evolution of adulthood. Decency creates a kind of default mercy, and default mercy allows many relationships to survive ordinary strains. In this case, that mercy did not protect the vulnerable. It was exploited by someone who knew how to appear harmless. The cultural fixation on the case often circles back to the same uneasy axis, how a person can continue performing normalcy in the presence of irreversible harm. The answer, if there is one, is less dramatic than people expect. Performance is often not a single conscious act. It can be the residue of habit. A person who has spent years smoothing friction can continue smoothing even as his internal world grows chaotic. He knows how to speak in ways that seem reasonable. He knows how to adopt a face that seems concerned. He knows how to occupy a role long enough to buy time. Time is what concealment needs most. As the legal outcome settled into permanence, the case entered a new category of public memory, not active suspense, but enduring disturbance. It became the kind of story that people reference when they want to illustrate a point about domestic danger, about deception, about the way a public image can mask a private collapse. Over time, the case stops being experienced by the public as news and becomes experienced as a cautionary symbol. And symbols are blunt instruments. They carry emotional weight, but they flatten complexity. The flattening has a cost. It can reduce the victims to an emblem rather than a full life. It can reduce the relationship dynamics to a simple narrative rather than a complicated human reality. Yet the weight of the story keeps pulling people back because the flattened version is still too heavy to hold comfortably. The mind keeps returning to the details that feel most real, the ordinary house, the routines, the calm demeanor, the absence that arrived without warning. The victim's family members, living within the permanence of that loss, were forced to exist with a kind of doubled reality. Their grief remained personal, intimate, and raw, but it was also mirrored by strangers, refracted through public interest, replayed in cycles. There is no clean boundary between mourning and exposure in such cases. The world keeps returning, and each return forces the grieving to encounter the story again in a form they did not choose. In a quieter sense, the case also reveals something about how modern life stores itself. A family today leaves behind a trail of existence, photos, videos, messages, calendars, GPS data, payment records, small digital markers that together form a map of a life. That storage can be comforting in ordinary loss because it provides relics and memories. In a case like this, it becomes something else, a dense archive of a life that ended violently and without consent, preserved with a clarity that makes the absence feel more unnatural, not less. The same archive that preserves memories also preserves contradictions. It captures the divergence between what was presented and what was happening beneath the surface. It holds the patterns of routine right up until routine breaks. It contains the proof that, in the days before the collapse, the family was still moving forward with plans and assumptions, still believing in a future that had already been quietly rejected by the person who lived with them. That rejection is the point the mind cannot rest on. It wants to believe that people, even in their worst moments, remain tethered to a basic reluctance to destroy what depends on them. This case insists that such reluctance is not guaranteed, and yet, even with that insistence, the story does not offer a clean portrait of the man as a constant monster. It offers something more unsettling, a portrait of gradual erosion. A portrait of a person who may have been emotionally limited, conflict avoidant, shaped by a need to be seen as good, and who then discovered that appearing good was not the same as being good. Once that distinction becomes usable, once a person realizes he can achieve social safety through performance alone, the internal guardrails can weaken. The outer world continues to reward him for seeming stable, and he begins to rely on that reward system even as his internal reality deteriorates. The deterioration does not always look like anger. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like a man becoming more engaged with his own body, his own routines, his own private life, as though self-improvement could substitute for moral structure. Sometimes it looks like a person removing himself emotionally from the household while remaining physically present, a form of disappearance that begins long before anyone is declared missing. This is where the story begins again and again, no matter how many times it is told, not with an explosion but with absence. Emotional absence first, then physical absence, then the permanent absence that cannot be repaired. The world can record what happened after that point. It can preserve the timeline and the consequences. But it cannot restore the moments before the collapse to what they were, because the knowledge of what came later alters them forever. Every smile in an old video becomes shadowed. Every family photo becomes heavy. Every ordinary day becomes haunted by the fact that it was the last ordinary day they were allowed to have. And so the story continues to live in that uneasy space between what was visible and what was hidden, between what looked like a normal family life and what was quietly forming beneath it. An internal shift, a private permission, a narrowing of empathy, until the surface finally broke and the calm morning became a boundary line the family could not cross back over. Once that boundary line is crossed, everything that comes after is shaped by a single reality. The old life cannot be restored, only examined. The examination continued in layers. At first, it was practical, locating what had been hidden, establishing a timeline firm enough to withstand denial. Then it became procedural, the conversion of raw events into formal accountability. And then it became something else entirely, a prolonged confrontation between public attention and private grief, between the sterile language of consequence and the intimate fact of lives that had been erased. The house, meanwhile, remained standing. Its rooms did not collapse, its stairs did not crumble. It continued to look like shelter. That is part of what made it so difficult to hold in the mind. People expect evil to alter a place physically, to leave scorch marks, to break the frame. But domestic destruction can pass through a home without leaving visible ruin. The ruin is in the meaning. It is in the knowledge that a space once filled with small routines could become the site where those routines stopped permanently. As the case moved through the final stages of legal resolution, the atmosphere around it tightened into a kind of heavy stillness. The early days had been loud with speculation and urgency, but the later phase carried a different pressure, quiet, formal, severe. In that environment, the human elements were not absent, they were compressed. They existed in faces and posture, in the way people held themselves when language could no longer carry the scale of what had happened. The man's presence within that environment carried its own harsh clarity. In the beginning, he had tried to inhabit ambiguity. He had tried to keep open the possibility that the story could remain uncertain, that doubt could protect him. Now doubt had narrowed. The world around him had hardened into fact. His body was still the same body that had stood in a driveway, still the same face that had tried to look concerned, but the context had changed so completely that even the smallest movement appeared magnified. There is a peculiar quiet that settles over a case once the central question is no longer what happened, but what consequence will follow. It is not the quiet of peace. It is the quiet of gravity. The process becomes less about discovery and more about finality. And finality, even when necessary, carries a coldness that no human emotion can soften. Within that coldness, the victim's absence remained the dominant presence. It was felt not through theatrical displays, but through the simple fact that they could not occupy any space again. The wife could not walk into a room. The children could not be carried into daylight. The future child could not be born into the life that had been assumed. Every procedural step, no matter how precise, existed in the shadow of that missing continuity. When the legal outcome closed around the man, it did not create a satisfying end. It created a sealed container. The case moved from open shock into permanent record, and that permanence did not settle the mind. It only fixed the horror in place. After that, the case entered another phase, one that is less visible but often more enduring, the long life of a story after its official conclusion. The man's world became smaller in practical terms. Routine replaced choice. The days began to resemble each other, not because time had healed anything, but because confinement produces a forced sameness. Yet outside the confines of his narrowed life, the story continued to expand. It traveled across years. It traveled across languages. It traveled through new audiences who encountered it as though it were present tense, even long after the events had become historical. This expansion is one of the strange realities of modern true crime. A case does not simply end when the legal process ends. It becomes a perpetual narrative that can be entered at any moment by anyone, preserved by a digital ecosystem that does not forget. Each retelling creates a fresh wave of reaction, as though the case is happening again, because for the new listener it effectively is. The grief, in that sense, becomes cyclical. The public's attention rises and falls, but the story remains available, ready to be reactivated. In this particular case, the reactivation always returns to the same unsettling hinge, the mismatch between surface and interior. People watch the old images and see what they want to see. Some see a family doing what families do, trying, struggling, presenting brightness in the midst of stress. Some see, in retrospect, signs of tension that were invisible at the time. But the images themselves cannot provide the crucial truth. because the crucial truth was not in the smiles. It was in the private decision-making that no camera could capture. The case forces a confrontation with how much of a person's real life is never seen, even by those closest to him. A marriage can involve shared beds, shared meals, shared obligations, and still contain an interior distance that grows without being spoken. A spouse can feel a shift and still not imagine the most catastrophic interpretation of it, because imagining it would be unbearable and, in most lives, unnecessary. The wife's awareness of strain, as it appears through the fragments of her last days, aligns with what many people have experienced: the sense that something is wrong, the attempt to pull the relationship back into alignment, the pressure of carrying both the practical and emotional burdens of a household. What the case did not allow her was the chance to treat wrongness as what it usually is: a problem that leads to argument, to separation, to repair, to a future that continues in some form. Instead, wrongness became a corridor leading somewhere irreversible. The children's role in the story remains the most difficult to integrate for a simple reason: their world was built on trust. Adult choices define the limits of a child's reality. A child does not negotiate the terms of safety. A child assumes it. That assumption is the invisible foundation of childhood. When it is shattered, the mind struggles not because it cannot understand violence, but because it cannot bear the violation of a dependency so complete. This is why the case retains its ability to disturb long after the facts are known. It is not only about betrayal between adults. It is about the collapse of the basic protective structure that a family is supposed to represent. And yet, the story does not present itself as a simple eruption of cruelty. It presents itself as a gradual narrowing of empathy, of tolerance for responsibility, of willingness to face complexity. It suggests that the man's internal world had been turning for a while, moving away from partnership and toward a private fantasy. It suggests that he had begun to interpret the family not as lives intertwined with his, but as an obstacle field he needed to clear. That narrowing is the psychological mechanism that returns again and again in the public's attempts to comprehend, not because it makes the outcome acceptable, but because it offers a structure. It provides a way to understand how someone can move from ordinary dissatisfaction to catastrophic action without passing through the obvious markers people expect. The case also leaves behind a quieter warning about the nature of control. Not the obvious, aggressive kind of control that announces itself through intimidation, but the subtle kind that operates through avoidance and secrecy. A person can control a household not by dominating it loudly, but by refusing to engage honestly, by forcing the other person to carry the emotional labor, by withdrawing and letting silence do the work. Silence can become a tool. It can pressure a spouse into uncertainty. It can keep conflict unresolved while allowing the silent person to preserve his image as calm. In this story, calm was not the absence of turmoil. It was part of the mechanism that allowed turmoil to remain hidden until it was too late. As years pass, the case continues to reshape the way people think about the home as an institution. The home is often treated as a private kingdom, a sealed space where outsiders cannot intervene unless invited. That privacy is essential to dignity and autonomy, but it also creates blind spots. It can allow certain dangers to develop in isolation. It can hide emotional collapse behind closed doors. The case becomes, for many, a reminder that privacy is not automatically safety. It is simply separation. Still, separation is not destiny. Most homes under strain do not end in catastrophe. Most people who experience desire outside their marriage do not convert that desire into annihilation. Most financial pressures do not turn lethal. The case remains disturbing precisely because it does not allow the comfort of assuming that its ingredients were rare. The ingredients were common. The outcome was not. So the story remains lodged in memory as a kind of exception that refuses to feel distant. It continues to echo in the simplest domestic scenes: a husband coming home later than expected, a spouse noticing a shift in affection, a household carrying debt and trying to keep smiling. These scenes are ordinary. They happen every day. The case intrudes into them not as a prediction, but as a reminder of how much can be hidden behind routine and how quickly a private decision can transform a life that looked from the outside like stability. And somewhere within that reminder, the same image persists: morning light on a quiet street, a house that looks like any other, and a sense, felt only afterward, that the day had already been altered before anyone else had the chance to notice. That alteration lingered because it was not confined to one day. It reached backward into the weeks before, turning small moments into points of tension once people knew where the timeline was heading. A late-night return, a quiet argument, a message left unanswered, a shift in warmth that might have once been dismissed as exhaustion. Each detail became heavier in retrospect, not because it contained the entire truth, but because it revealed how close the family had been to a precipice without being able to name it. The case lived for a long time in those margins between what was felt and what was understood. It also lived in the system that preserved it. The modern world records itself constantly, and in this story, that record became a kind of shadow companion to the narrative. Movements were measurable. Contacts were traceable. The days left behind patterns that could be assembled into a structure too rigid to accommodate innocence. The more that structure solidified, the less space remained for ambiguity, and the more the man's earlier composure began to look like a form of time buying, an attempt to keep the world from catching up to what had already been done. Yet even when the facts hardened, there remained a quieter question that refused to settle: what the man believed he was doing to himself as he dismantled the life around him. Some people commit harm while believing they are cutting away a burden. Others commit harm while believing they are escaping humiliation. Others commit harm while believing they are correcting a mistake. The record cannot fully reveal which internal story he used to authorize the act. It can only show that authorization existed, because action of that scale does not happen without an internal permission strong enough to override the basic human reluctance to destroy what depends on you. The permission may have been built from resentment, or from the dulling effect of secrecy, or from the narrowing obsession of a new relationship that made the old life feel uninhabitable. It may have been reinforced by financial pressure and the fatigue of pretending. It may have been strengthened by a lifelong habit of avoiding conflict until conflict becomes an emergency. Whatever its ingredients, it produced the same outcome, a private decision treated as a solution, carried out in a world that still believed in the stability of the family. After the case was sealed by the legal process, the man's world became defined by containment in the most literal sense. The days were no longer shaped by choice but by schedule, repetition, and restricted movement. This kind of confinement does not create theatrical suffering, it creates sameness. It produces a life where hours are carved into predictable segments, where the future is no longer a field of possibility but a corridor with fixed walls. In that corridor, memory behaves differently. It cannot be avoided by work, by family noise, by the small distractions that once filled a home. It becomes part of the air. Outside that corridor, the story continued to move through the world, resurfacing in waves. It returned whenever new attention settled on domestic cases, whenever people sought to understand how an ordinary household can conceal a private collapse, whenever the culture returned to the uncomfortable fact that danger does not always arrive from the outside. Each wave brought new eyes to old images, and the images continued to carry the same contradiction, brightness on the surface, strain underneath, and a final act that made every earlier moment feel as though it had been standing on a trapdoor. The victims' lives, preserved in fragments, continued to exert their own gravity. Not as plot points, not as symbols, but as reminders of the ordinary continuity that had been erased. It is one thing to understand a case in terms of motive and sequence. It is another to sit with the quieter reality of what was removed, the years that would have unfolded, the arguments that would have been resolved, the birthdays that would have arrived, the mundane mornings that would have passed without becoming a landmark in anyone's memory. That mundane continuity is what the mind keeps returning to because it is the most human part of the loss. The tragedy is not only that the end was violent, it is that the middle was stolen, the long stretch of ordinary life that most people take for granted, the part of a family story that is rarely photographed because it is assumed to be guaranteed. For the broader public, the case became a reference point for a particular kind of fear, not fear of strangers, but fear of misreading familiarity. People began to look at calmness differently, at politeness differently, at the quiet, agreeable posture of a person who does not make waves. None of that is inherently threatening. In most lives, it is neutral or even comforting. But this story showed how those same traits can also function as camouflage when a person is willing to let empathy erode in private. The camouflage was not perfect. It could not survive a world that measures time and contradiction with increasing precision. The case demonstrated that modern life leaves behind too many traces for a false narrative to remain stable for long. Yet the presence of those traces did not make the story less disturbing. It made it more so, because it suggested that the man moved through the early hours believing he could manage the record, believing he could outpace the inevitable tightening of reality around him. That belief, confidence in control, often sits at the center of domestic collapse. It is not always expressed as arrogance in the ordinary sense. Sometimes it is expressed as a quiet assumption that other people will behave predictably, that the world will accept a plausible story. That emotion can be performed convincingly enough to delay the moment when facts become unavoidable. In this case, the delay was brief. The tightening began almost immediately. But even a brief delay matters when the goal is concealment, because concealment depends on the hope that time will soften attention. Attention, instead, sharpened. The family's home, emptied and then examined, remained as a kind of fixed point in the narrative, a place where people imagined the last ordinary moments, where they tried to understand how the collapse could have occurred without announcing itself to the outside world. Over time, the house became less a real structure and more a symbol of private life turned inside out. A home is supposed to contain and protect. Here, containment became something else entirely, and protection failed at the deepest level. And still, beneath all the public meaning and repeated analysis, the case continued to rest on a simpler, quieter fact. The people inside that home trusted the man because trust is what family life requires. It is not earned every day from scratch. It is assumed and reinforced through routine, through shared meals and shared plans and the steady repetition of ordinary care. When that assumption is exploited, the betrayal does not end with the act itself. It spreads outward into the way people understand trust as a concept, making it feel more conditional, more fragile, more dependent on signals that can be faked. This is why the story continues to feel unresolved even when the outcome is fixed. The system can close the case. The timeline can be established. The consequence can be imposed. But the emotional disturbance remains active because it touches something foundational, the belief that the people closest to you are, by default, the people least likely to harm you. The case does not merely contradict that belief. It forces the recognition that belief is a vulnerability necessary for intimacy, and that vulnerability can be exploited in silence. It forces the recognition that the calmest hours of a household, the late-night quiet, the early morning routine, can become the cover under which irreversible decisions are carried out. And so the story continues to live where it began, in the space between ordinary life and hidden intention, in the soft light of a morning that looked like every other morning until it became, without warning, the dividing line between a family's assumed future and the reality that replaced it. The word end does not behave the way people expect in a case like this. It suggests a clean finality, a door closing, a narrative that can be placed on a shelf and left alone. But some stories do not accept that kind of closure. They settle instead into the slow, persistent life of aftermath, where the facts are fixed and the disturbance continues to move under the surface of ordinary days. After the last procedural steps have been taken, after the formal consequences have been assigned, the world outside the confined space of the perpetrator's new life is left with something that cannot be processed through documents. The loss remains too large, too intimate, too intrusive. It presses itself into places where it does not belong because it has nowhere else to go. It returns in the quiet minutes before sleep, in the sudden stillness of a morning kitchen, in the way a child's laughter can sound both bright and fragile at the same time. The house becomes a strange kind of anchor for that return. It sits in a neighborhood designed for repetition, for stability, for the reassurance of routine. Its exterior does not tell the truth because buildings rarely do. The siding and windows, the slope of a roof, the neat boundary between lawn and sidewalk, all of it belongs to a visual language meant to communicate safety. When a home becomes associated with catastrophe, that language does not disappear. It becomes distorted. It continues to signal comfort while holding something that cannot be made comfortable. The result is a dissonance that lingers in the mind long after the case is no longer active in the news cycle. People pass such places and feel something tighten, even if they cannot articulate what it is. The tightening is not superstition. It is recognition that human life, when it collapses in a contained space, leaves an imprint that does not require physical damage to be real. A home can remain standing and still feel broken because it is no longer merely a shelter. It has become a symbol of a private failure so complete it rewrites what shelter is supposed to mean. Time continues, of course. Seasons still rotate through the same predictable patterns. Snow, heat, wind, the ordinary churn of weather across quiet streets. The neighborhood continues to produce its familiar sounds, engines starting, garage doors lifting, footsteps on pavement, a dog barking behind a fence. These sounds return because the world is built to return to itself. Yet for those who know the story, the sounds do not always land the same way. They carry an additional layer, a faint vibration of mistrust, because the case taught a brutal lesson about how ordinary sounds can continue uninterrupted even while something irreversible is unfolding behind closed doors. This is one of the most unsettling realities in domestic crime. The outside world often remains calm. The street remains asleep. The neighbors remain uninvolved. The darkness holds its secrecy without effort, not because anyone colluded, but because the architecture of private life allows concealment to function as a default. The home is a protected perimeter. In most lives, that perimeter is a necessary boundary that allows dignity and intimacy. In cases like this, the same boundary becomes a cover. The public record, preserved in modern detail, makes the cover feel thinner, yet it does not remove it. It only clarifies it afterward. Data can map a route and fix a time, but it cannot step into a bedroom and stop a decision from being carried out. Cameras can capture motion, but not the internal shift that makes motion lethal. Messages can show contact, but not conscience. The case, in that sense, becomes a reminder that evidence is retrospective by nature. It is a form of light that arrives after the moment has already passed. What remains for the public is a repeated confrontation with the mismatch between what was visible and what was real. The family's images, bright fragments of birthdays, smiles, shared routines, continue to circulate because modern life stores itself in visible form. Those images become difficult to look at not because they are false in the narrow sense, but because they are incomplete. They show moments that existed, but they cannot show what was happening in the spaces between those moments, the accumulating strain, the private resentments, the compartmentalization, the secret life that was being built alongside the shared one. This incompleteness becomes a kind of gravitational center for endless interpretation. People return to the footage and photographs as though they might reveal a hidden signal, a micro-expression that could unlock the puzzle. They study the man's face for a slip, for a crack, for anything that would allow the mind to feel safer by believing the truth was always visible. But the story resists that comfort. It insists that visibility is not the same as knowledge, and that the signals people rely on, politeness, calmness, the appearance of responsibility, can exist without the moral substance they are assumed to represent. The man's calm demeanor, preserved in those early moments, continues to exert its own unsettling force. Calm is normally interpreted as self-control, as steadiness, as the presence of a mind trying to protect others from panic. In this case, calm became ambiguous. It could be read as a practiced performance, a habitual mask, a controlled effort to manage perception. It could also be read as emotional vacancy, the absence of the internal chaos most people would expect in the presence of such loss. The ambiguity itself is what lingers, because it destabilizes a basic social instinct, the instinct to trust what appears measured and composed. This destabilization spreads beyond the case. It settles into the way people evaluate others in moments of crisis, into the subtle suspicion that a steady face does not guarantee a steady conscience. That suspicion is corrosive, not because it is irrational, but because it erodes a social world built on assumed decency. Most people are not living double lives. Most families under strain do not end in catastrophe. Most calm responses in emergencies are exactly what they appear to be. Yet a single case like this can contaminate the symbolic meaning of calmness, turning it into something people watch with a fraction more doubt. The story also persists because it does not offer a neat explanation that isolates it as an anomaly. The pressures it contained were not exotic. Financial strain is common. Relationship tension is common. Emotional withdrawal is common. Infidelity is common. The frightening element is not the presence of those factors. It is the way they intersected with a particular internal architecture, a personality capable of intense compartmentalization, a mind willing to recast responsibility as imprisonment, a capacity to treat other human beings as removable. Removable is not a word people like to apply to family. Family is supposed to be permanent by design, bound by obligation and attachment even when affection falters. When a person begins to experience family as removable, it suggests a collapse not only of love, but of the fundamental recognition of others as ends in themselves. It suggests a shift toward a cold utilitarianism, where relationships are evaluated primarily by how they serve a private desire for comfort, freedom, or reinvention. Reinvention in many lives is harmless. People change jobs, move towns, reshape themselves after difficult years. The desire to begin again is not in itself abnormal. What becomes dangerous is when reinvention is pursued as though it is a right that overrides the existence of other people. In the man's private life, reinvention appears to have become fused with fantasy, a future where obligations vanish cleanly, where the past can be discarded without consequence, where a new relationship can bloom without the shadow of the old one. Fantasy has a particular power because it is frictionless. It does not contain the daily irritations of real partnership. It does not contain the complex logistics of parenting. It does not contain the bills and compromises and fatigue that shape ordinary family life. In fantasy, the self remains central. The world rearranges itself around desire. When someone becomes emotionally invested in a fantasy, reality begins to feel like a hostile environment, a heavy and unfair set of limitations. Under that perception, ordinary responsibilities can start to feel not like commitments freely chosen, but like chains imposed. That perception is often where empathy begins to thin. A person who experiences his life as imposed can begin to view those around him not as companions, but as enforcers of the imposed life. A spouse becomes the face of constraint. Children become the evidence of permanence. Financial obligations become the proof that escape will not be clean. The mind that is leaning toward self-centered reasoning can then begin to justify increasingly extreme solutions, not necessarily because it is consumed by rage, but because it is consumed by the belief that the self is entitled to relief. The case suggests this kind of internal entitlement grew while the man's outer behavior remained superficially stable. He continued to move through routines, continued to present an image, continued to occupy a role. That ability to occupy a role is crucial. It allows a person to function socially even as his internal reality becomes dangerous. It is the mechanism that permits concealment to operate. The person does not need to be chaotic. In fact, chaos would draw attention. Stability becomes an advantage. A calm manner becomes a shield. In the aftermath, the victims' lives are left suspended in the public mind as a painful contradiction. The wife is remembered both as an individual and as a figure in a narrative that was not her choice. The children are remembered as innocents, but innocence is an abstraction unless it is anchored in the small details of how they lived, their size, their routines, the way childhood fills a room with motion and noise, the way young lives are defined by trust so complete it feels like the natural order of the world. Trust is the invisible infrastructure of a family. It is the assumption that allows people to sleep, to turn away, to stop monitoring each other's motives every hour of the day. Trust is what makes intimacy possible. The case endures as a disturbance because it demonstrates how that infrastructure can be exploited by someone who knows how to appear harmless. It shows how vulnerability, which is necessary for love, can also be the opening through which betrayal becomes catastrophic. For those left behind, the grief is layered with exposure. It is not only the ache of absence. It is the knowledge that the absence is publicly owned in some way, that strangers will continue to revisit it, interpret it, retell it, sometimes with reverence and sometimes with detachment. Grief under those conditions becomes a long negotiation between the need to remember privately and the unavoidable fact that the story has become part of a public archive. The names, the images, the basic outlines of their lives are no longer fully theirs to control. The public archive is relentless because it is accessible. It can be opened at any hour. It can be entered by anyone. It can be consumed in a single sitting and then left behind, only to be reopened again later. Each reopening creates a new wave of attention, a renewed sense of present tense shock for people encountering it for the first time. This repeated reactivation is one of the defining features of modern true crime. The legal case can be closed, but the narrative remains open, endlessly available, perpetually capable of resurfacing. That resurfacing keeps the disturbance alive. It also keeps the victims present in a way that is both honoring and unbearable. Their faces remain bright in photographs. Their lives remain captured at moments meant to celebrate. The contrast between that brightness and the knowledge of what happened creates a lasting emotional friction. It does not fade with familiarity. In many cases, familiarity deepens the ache because the mind begins to know the images too well to recognize them the way it recognizes the faces of people it has never met but cannot forget. The man, living inside the narrow corridor of confinement, becomes part of that friction as well. His continued existence is not a comfort. It is a fact that sits alongside the absence of those he erased. The contrast between his ongoing routine and their permanent silence is one of the enduring imbalances that the human mind cannot reconcile. Consequence can restrict him, isolate him, and remove him from ordinary life. It cannot restore the lives that were taken. It cannot reverse the erasure. It can only insist that the world acknowledges what happened by refusing to allow him to return to freedom. Even that insistence does not produce true resolution because the deepest unresolved element is not legal. It is existential. It is the recognition that a person can share a home with those who love him, benefit from their trust, and still carry within him a private decision that nullifies them entirely. This recognition does not remain confined to the case. It spills outward into the way people imagine domestic safety. It introduces a faint crack into the belief that home is automatically refuge, and yet the world continues to rely on that belief because without it, ordinary life becomes impossible. People cannot live in constant suspicion of their closest relationships. They cannot raise children under the assumption that every intimacy is a risk. Society depends on a certain baseline trust, a willingness to assume decency unless evidence demands otherwise. The case sits like a stone in the middle of that baseline, forcing a confrontation with its fragility while offering no alternative way to live. So the story remains heavy and unfinished in a particular way. Not unfinished in the sense that facts are missing, but unfinished in the sense that its meaning cannot be resolved into a single lesson. It remains a reminder that some collapses begin quietly, that some dangers wear familiar faces, and that the transition from ordinary strain to irreversible harm can occur without any public alarm. The neighborhood returns to its routines. New families move through the same kinds of houses. Children ride bicycles on the same sidewalks. Lights glow behind curtains at night. The architecture continues to suggest comfort because that is what it was built to suggest. But for those who carry the memory, the suggestion is never pure again. It is layered with knowledge, a knowledge that does not announce itself loudly, but that can surface in the stillest moments. A calm morning, after all, is only calm until it is interrupted. It is only ordinary until it becomes the last ordinary morning someone is allowed to have. And that is the quiet terror that stays with the story, not the spectacle of crime, not the procedural certainty of consequence, but the invisible shift that occurred before anyone else could perceive it. An internal narrowing, a private permission, a decision moving forward in silence while the rest of the world continued to behave as though the day would unfold the way it always had, and as though the home, by virtue of its appearance, could still be trusted to protect what was inside.